it's Courtney. I'm here with a video using the latest Simon Says stamp card kit. Just taking a quick look at what's in the kit. We get some vintage drops by Nuvo. We have a die by Simon Says Stamp. We have some stickers by Simple Stories called Spring Farmhouse. We have some envelopes, and these are shimmery. I'm not sure if the camera picks those up. We also have a piece of the Sizzix black foam adhesive. We have a piece of craft cardstock, and we also have some pattern papers, and these are actually 6x8 papers, and this is by Simple Stories as well. They're all double-sided. Of course, we have the Hello Darling stamp set, which is a 6x8 clear stamp set by Simon. We have some cardstock, and this is sea glass, ivory, cotton candy, and dark chocolate. And as always, they give you a inspiration sheet as well as a list of all of the supplies that comes in the kit. So we're going to jump right into the first card here, and I have a piece of the patterned paper and stitched rectangle dies by Simon Says Stamp. I used the largest and the second to largest. And I cut the second to largest out using a piece of Canson watercolor paper. And I'm going to go ahead and use my Misty. I'm going to stamp this twice, and I'm using antique linen, and this is regular distress ink because I'm going to be doing some kind of watercoloring, I guess, with some Zig clean color markers. So the distress ink will kind of melt into the paper or into the color as I go along. But I'm using just one color here, and I'm kind of outlining the left hand or bottom left hand side of the letters. It really honestly doesn't matter where you put your color, but if you want to have a watercolor look, don't fill in the whole letter. You'll just want to pick a side and kind of stick with that. So once I had the initial color down, I'm going in with a damp #2 round brush. So I'm just dipping in my water and kind of dabbing that off on a paper towel, and then filling in the entire letter and letting my color kind of spread out a little bit. I was having a problem with my color kind of spreading for whatever reason, so I just scribbled a little bit of that marker onto an acrylic block, and occasionally in certain areas, if I have any problems with it kind of spreading and blending out, I'll just pick a little bit of that color up with my damp paintbrush and kind of just dab that into some of the wet or damp areas on the paper and let that spread. So I'm just continuing along here, kind of adding a little bit of that color, and I'm just using the very tip of the pen. The Zig markers do have a really, really fine tip, so it's kind of easy to kind of just put down a little bit of the color. This is a pretty dark color, but it does match once it's kind of spread out. It kind of matches the pattern paper that I'm going to be using for the card. So I'm just kind of continuing with all of the letters, both words, with the same color. And then we're going to kind of do the same thing with the little leaves and the flowers that are around my sentiment, around the words. So if you happen to go out of the line, make sure that you have this dry before you fix up any of your mistakes. So you'll see in the end with this one L here, I'm going to fix that later, but I do want to wait till that's dry. So next for the leaves, I'm going to be using obviously a green, and I'm just putting a little bit of color down on the base of the leaf. And then again, going in with a damp paintbrush, dabbing that off on a paper towel before bringing that to my paper, starting off on the tip of the leaf and kind of bringing that water down to that pigment and letting that spread out, and coloring all of the leaves the same exact way. As far as the flowers go, we're pretty much going to do the same for those as well. Going to be using kind of like a yellowish color, and I'm just putting a little bit of pigment down on the, I guess it would be the base of the petals, but it's kind of just like a blobby flower. So it doesn't really matter too much. And then going again in with that damp paintbrush into the areas that have no pigment, bringing that down to the pigment and letting that spread out. So once the panel was dry, I'm going to go in with just clean water and that paintbrush and kind of go over the areas that, well, first I filled in the little centers of the flowers, but I'm going to go in with that damp paintbrush and just kind of go over some of the areas that I went out of the lines and then dab that up with a paper towel. I used the large stitch rectangle die to cut out my pattern paper, laid that down in an A2 size note card, and then put my main panel right there in the center with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, and then used the vintage drops that are part of the kit and just kind of scattered those onto the little dots that are part of the image. And then I added a few more on my own as well, making these all different sizes. So that is it for card number 1. We'll jump right into card number 2, and I'm going to use these 2 solid leaf images from the stamp set, and I'm working on a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is 5.5 by 4.25. I'm using Jelly Bean ink by Simon Says Stamp, and this is a light green ink because I'm going to be doing some no-line coloring with this. So I'm starting off with the larger leaf here, and for whatever reason I paused. I don't know what I was doing there, but I'm kind of just scattering that throughout the card panel, stamping off the card panel and rotating my stamp each time. Then I'll go in with the smaller leaf and I'm just filling in some of the blank areas, again, twisting and turning that each time and stamping off the card panel itself so it makes it look like it's one continuous design. Now, once that's done, I will go ahead and move on to the coloring, and I'm going to be using my Copic markers here, and I'm just going to show you a little bit. I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, being I already have a base color down, which will, in the end, pretty much be my highlight. Just going to put a little bit of shading off to the left-hand side of the stem, and then a little bit of shading in the center of the leaf, kind of working my way up. And then blending that out with my mid-tone color, just extending those flicks out a little bit further. Going in with the YG03, and this is my lightest mid-tone. And this is very similar to that Jelly Bean ink. And then finally going in with the YG01, which is almost identical to the Jelly Bean ink. And there I am pausing again. I think I made this card when my mom was over, so I must have been talking to her. And then just filling in those areas and blending the rest of that out. I'll just show you one more leaf here, but I did this the same way. It's just one single leaf, making sure that shading is off to the left-hand side of the stem, blending that out with the darkest mid-tone, then the lightest mid-tone, and then finally finishing that off with the YG01, filling in that entire area. I colored all of the leaves the same exact way with the same color combination. And then I was originally going to stamp my sentiment with that Jelly Bean ink, but realized it was going to blend in way too much. So I ended up using a little bit darker of a color here, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out and then fussy cut this. I'm going to leave a small white border just because I want this to kind of stand out from my background. I want to leave my background the background. So I'm just turning the paper as I go with my left hand and keeping my scissors somewhat straight with my right hand or whatever your dominant hand is. And this will allow you to get a pretty clean cut and get those edges, clean edges instead of those jagged edges that you sometimes get. Just keeping your scissors straight will help you with that. So once that was all cut out, I kind of placed that in the center. It was a little plain, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the main panel down, and this is the inside out diagonal stitched rectangle die by MFT. And then I'm going to take another piece of the Neenah Solar White, and I'm going to use one of my mid-tone colors to just color in the outer edges of the card panel, and that way it'll appear that I used some colored cardstock that perfectly matches the colors that I used for the leaves. But I do this a lot, so everything matches perfectly. I'm going to go ahead and layer that main panel onto that colored panel with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, adhering this flat down. Then I took a small piece of Scotch foam tape to go ahead and pop up my little Hello Spring sentiment right there in the center of my card panel. And it is looking a little bit plain, but it is what it is. Hopefully the background will kind of take away from the plainness, I guess you could say. And then once that's popped up, I'm going to use that same Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere this down to an A2 size note card. I'm not going to have any border. This is exactly the size of an A2 size card. And then last, I'll take my Nuvo Aqua Shimmer Pen just to add some sparkle to that sentiment leaf right there. And that is card number 2. Now for card number 3, which is I think is my favorite out of the 5 that we created today, I'm going to be using the die that comes in the kit. And in order to make my coloring a little bit easier, I'm going to squeeze a little bit of that Tombow Mono Multi Glue and kind of smear that around with my finger and let that dry. Once it's dry, it's repositionable. So I'm just going to stick that down to a scrap piece of paper so that it doesn't move around while I'm coloring. So going to jump into the Copic coloring here, and I'm going to color this die the same way as I color every other image, starting off with my lightest color to map out my darkest areas. I'm going to have a left side or top left light source for this one because I have one boot hanging behind the other. So I'm going to create a shadow where that one boot is behind the other on the base of the boots and where they're kind of that little flap is kind of hanging over the rest of it, I guess, if that makes sense. Next, going in with the E37 and just going over the very darkest areas. And I am using a little bit of a flicking motion here because I'm going to be using some Y markers and my darkest color is pretty dark and it's obviously a brown. I may have some problems blending, which I did. But in order to help with that, a lot of times if you use this small flicking motion, even if you're just flicking out just a little bit, it will make your blending a little bit easier in the end. Next, I'm going to go in with what I thought was going to be my midtone. I was originally just going to be using 3 colors here, and I started to extend this E37 out. And for some of the areas I didn't have too much of a problem, but other areas I just could not get these to blend. So I decided to use a different dark midtone. I decided to bring in a 4th color. So I'm going to bring in the Y28 and blend that E37 out. And even though this is kind of like it's not a pretty color. It's considered to be gold, but it's kind of like a dull gold, but it works well for my darkest midtone. It will kind of brighten everything up once I get to the lightest midtone and the highlight color. So I was able to blend that out with the Y26 much easier. And I'm just leaving a little bit of a highlight off to the left-hand side of each one of the boots and on the little toe part of the boots for that Y23. And I'll just fill in the rest of those areas. Now I'm going to skip the sole of the boots for now because at this point I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do with them. So we're going to go on to the flowers, and I'm just going to show you one of the flowers. I colored them all the same way with the same color combination. And again, going to start off with my lightest color to map out my darkest areas. I had to kind of move that around a little bit to see where my shadow should be. It was kind of hard to see on that white scrap piece of paper that I had there. So going in, I'm only using a 3-color blend here, going in and just adding some shading on what would be the petals on either side, and then just a little bit of shading in the center petal. Going in with the darkest color and just going over those same areas that we had mapped out, blending that out with the mid-tone, extending those flicks right there in the center for the center petal, and then finally going back in with the lightest color and blending all of those colors together. Again, colored all of the flowers the same way with that color combination. For the leaves, I'm going to bring in some YG90 markers, starting off again with that lightest color, getting the paper saturated and mapping out the darkest areas. Just going to create some shadows underneath the flower, on the stem for underneath the flower and kind of where it's coming out of the boot. And for the leaves, it'll just be pretty much in the center of each of the leaves and just blending that out with the mid-tone and then finally the lightest color again. And I use the same color combination for all the leaves and the stems as well. For the little soles of the boots, I was originally going to have the E57 be my darkest color, but realized that that was blending in a little bit too much with the boots themselves. So I ended up bringing in the E59 and just added a little bit of shading off to the right-hand side, blended that out with the E57 and just used the E55 just for the highlight on the very left-hand side. And you just want to be careful when you peel this up, and you may find some white areas that you missed, because it's hard to tell on your scrap piece of paper, especially if you use a white piece of paper. So I'll just use a marker and kind of fill in those areas that were left blank. So I'm going to go ahead and cut down my card panel here, and I'm using just a die cut circle and some antique linen distress oxide ink and a blendability brush. So I know a lot of people use the makeup brushes. I just want a very subtle frame, I guess you could say, around where I'm going to put my little die cut. And this will kind of just give a little bit something extra to a very plain card panel. So next I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have my die cut right in the lower right-hand side. And for my sentiment, I am going to be using, well, actually first I cut down a very, very skinny strip of another piece of Nina Solar White and using the mid-tone that I used for the flowers. And this is going to go to the left-hand side of my card panel, as well as a strip of one of the pattern papers. Going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment with dark chocolate ink by Simon Says Stamp, and I'm just going to put that in the top left-hand corner to kind of even everything out. I'll go ahead and adhere that panel off to the right-hand side of an A2 size note card, and then I'm going to adhere that pinkish purplish strip that we had created directly next to that, and then finally finishing off the left-hand side with a piece of the pattern paper. And I used a piece of the wood grain paper. It's actually it has like a large sentiment in the center, so I just use the side of it. And then I'll use my paper trimmer to kind of cut off any excess that is hanging off, and I'll use my scissors for certain areas as well. But my card panel was slightly larger than my card base, so it was just easier to use my paper trimmer and kind of be able to cut through all of those layers. So once that was done, I will go ahead and adhere my die cut here. I'm going to lay this flat. I was going to pop it up, but there's so many pieces kind of sticking out that I found it easier just to lay this flat down, and I adhered that with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. And last, added a few Nuvo drops. This is Rhubarb Crumble Nuvo drops, and I felt like this matched the flowers pretty well. And you'll see that I did squeeze this out on a little scrap piece of paper to make sure there was no air bubbles, but it seemed a little bit thicker than it normally is, and I had a little bit of a blob right there. So I couldn't fix it. It's too dark of a color. So I made my drops a little bit bigger than I normally was going to. And once this dries, I'll just take a white gel pen and go over that little area that's kind of blobby right there, and you'll never know the difference. There'll still be the texture, but there won't be any color. So for my next card here, I have a piece of the ivory cardstock that comes in the kit, and I'm using some of these border stamps. And I'll be honest with you, I had a very hard time lining these up on my Misty because of the grid mat being underneath the grid on my Misty. I was having a hard time seeing what grid I was using. So I placed all three and kind of lined those up together, but making some a little bit longer than others. Stamped this twice with my black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp and realized that it was still crooked. I just couldn't get it straight. So I ended up using the same card panel because I knew I was going to cut this down anyway. And I realigned that bottom stamp there a little bit better than I did the first time. I'll just flip over my card panel, no need to waste another, and restamp that again, stamp that twice just to get a very bold black image. Once that was done, I'm going to take the little bike that is part of the stamp set, and I'm going to switch over to Fade Out ink by Ink on 3, because this, I mean, I could do this solid, but I wanted to have a little bit of color added to it. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out directly above my little border stamps there. And then I'm going to fill in those. I'm basically going to go directly over the outline of the image. I'm going to start off with the flowers, and I'm just going to use an RV marker. I'm not doing any shading whatsoever, but I picked a color that is very similar to some of the colors that are in the pattern paper that we're going to be using. And same thing with the leaves, going to use a YG marker that is very similar to the colors in that pattern paper. And for the bike itself, I'm going to use my black Copic marker and pretty much just go over the entire outline. Now, I was doing well until I got to the second wheel or tire or whatever, but it just wasn't looking right. I figured I would continue with the card and try to fix that later, which I did. It's just not going to be with the marker. It was spread a little bit on this paper, so I was too afraid that I was going to totally mess up that circle. So I'll fix that in a little bit once we get the rest of the card put together. So we're going to keep this pretty simple. I am using that inside out diagonal stitched rectangle die by MFT. This time I'm going to use the second to largest one because it's sitting on my desk, so I figured why not. And I'm going to go ahead and cut down this panel. I did stick this down with some Post-it note tape so it doesn't shift around while it's going through my Gemini. Then I'm going to go ahead and add my sentiment also from the same stamp set, and I'm going to stamp this down with that black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp right there on the top part of this panel. Now this is where I realized that that wheel off to the right hand side was just not okay. The one to the left wasn't so bad, but I'm using a EK Success journaling pen to kind of fix up that area, those areas. I was too afraid to go back in with my Copic marker and have that spread. So I just went in with a finer tip and fixed up those areas a little bit. So I'm going to take that pattern paper, which is cut down to 5.5 by 4 1/4, and I'm going to stick that flat down onto my A2 size note card. And then I'm going to take a piece of fun foam that is cut down just slightly smaller than my main panel, using my ATG gun to adhere that foam to the back of my card panel, and then using that same adhesive to add that to the other side of the foam to pop that up onto my card or onto that pattern paper. And I layered this right in the center on the top portion of the card. And I left this one as is, nice and simple. So for my fifth and final card for today, I'm going to start off with a Distress Ink watercolor background. So I have a piece of Canson watercolor paper, and I have this taped down to just an old clipboard so I don't have too much warping. And I'm using, originally I was using Worn Lipstick, but I ended up switching over to Picked Raspberry. And I'm using Seedless Preserves, Dusty Concord, and Mermaid Lagoon, just adding a little bit of water to where I smushed these ink pads onto my Ranger craft mat. And then I'm going to add this to my paper, and my paper is dry to begin with. And this is where I realized that Worn Lipstick was way too light. So I decided to bring in the Picked Raspberry, which is just a little bit brighter than the Worn Lipstick, and I liked this much better. So I'm going to go over these a few different times to get these colors to blend. And of course, adding more moisture to the paper will help these blend as well. And I'll go ahead and put my panel aside. I prefer to air dry it, but you can certainly use your heat tool to kind of speed up the process. Next, we're going to take a piece of vellum, and this is cut down to a little bit smaller than what my other panel will be. And treated this with my anti-static tool, and I'm going to stamp this large Hello Darling sentiment with Versamark ink, and I'm using my Misty just because it is a huge image. So I ended up stamping this twice because on the vellum it's hard to tell if you got a good impression, so I figured I may as well stamp it twice just to make sure. I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle on some white Hero Arts embossing powder, and you'll want to make sure that your heat gun is really heated up before bringing this to the paper. Next, I'm going to add a shadow. So I'm going in with my C7 and I'm just using the very tip of my marker, and I'm just going to go on the lower left-hand side of each of the letters. I didn't bother to create a shadow for the leaves or the flowers. I'm pretty much just sticking to the letters. And it's okay if you go over your embossing. I know you're not supposed to use Copics over embossing, but the amount that you'd go over the letters, I wasn't too concerned about it. I'll fix that up with a white gel pen in a minute. Once my C7 was down, I'm going to go ahead and bring out my C5, and I'm just going to extend those areas out and kind of soften those a little bit. With the C7, C7 is very, very dark, so it kind of looks like a harsh line at this point. So in order for these to look like a shadow, I'm just going to extend those and soften those out with my C5. So once my shadow was done, I'll go ahead and take that white gel pen and fix up any of those areas that I accidentally colored over my letters, and also fixing up some of the areas that I didn't get a great result with my embossing, where there's kind of like, where it looks like there's like holes in it. I know it's all happened to all of us, so I just use a white gel pen to fix those. I ended up trimming both of my panels down. My watercolor panel is cut down to 5.5 by 4.25, and my vellum piece is cut down to 5 by 3.75. Going to go ahead and adhere my watercolor panel flat down to an A2 size note card using my ATG gun, just because I find that a stronger adhesive for watercolor paper is best. And then in order to get my vellum piece there, I'm going to add my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to the areas behind my letters so that doesn't show through, and then a couple of random areas on the vellum. And even though you're going to see this, I'm going to cover this up with the Nuvo drop, so in the end you won't see any of the adhesive. I'm going to kind of hold this down for a minute because it is a little bit warped from the heat, and vellum doesn't always stick immediately. Going to take those vintage drops from Nuvo that came in the kit, and I'm going directly over where I have those little drops of glue shining through. I did have one area that was kind of coming up, so I added a little bit more glue and then another Nuvo drop. So these are the 5 cards that we had created today. This is only part 1 of my 10 cards, 1 kit for Simon Says Stamp. I will be back again tomorrow with the next 5 cards. Thanks for stopping by, guys. Have a great day. Bye.